Hello, and welcome to this week's Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law, editor of the Digest, and my guest today is Renad Mansour, Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa Program and Director of the Iraq Initiative at London's Chatham House. Renad, welcome back to the podcast.
It's great to be back with you, Bill.
Iraq has a new Prime Minister, Ali al-Zaidi. He has a background in the banking sector. Indeed, he owns a private bank. But what can you tell our listeners about Mr. al-Zaidi? And does he come with strings attached to one faction or another?
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister, Ali al-Zaidi, has taken many by surprise. The first Prime Minister since regime change in Iraq to come completely out from away from the typical, political / government elite. He has very little political background, doesn't have a political party, hasn't worked, formally in the government. He's a businessman, not just a banker. He's one of these very, very wealthy Iraqis who has a bank, has a university, has a TV channel, famously made, significant money working on the Iraq's ration cards and all sorts of different government contracts. So, he's coming at this from not the typical route. However, anyone who knows what it's like to do business in Iraq knows that it's not necessarily only living in the private sector. And most of his money has actually come through contracts that have, in one way or another, had connections to the state and to the wealthy Iraqi state. So the argument being made by those around him is Iraq's biggest concern at the moment is its economy, with the Strait of Hormuz closing and Iraq's main export being oil through the Strait of Hormuz. What's needed is someone who can both approach issues from an economic / financial way and know how to, in a way, navigate the murky Iraqi state to get things done. So that's the argument being made of why this very young outsider took Iraq's top job.
When you say young, how old is he?
Well, he's 41. So very, very young.
Yes, I think by ages of politicians in Iraq, that is young. And he comes from private sector, as you say. But does he not have some strings attached somewhere?
He, of course, no one becomes prime minister in Iraq without, having made deals with the elites around. In fact, the way the office works in Iraq is, while on paper, the prime minister is meant to be the most powerful man in Iraq, that's not the case. The prime minister is at the behest of the, what we call the ruling elites, the political elites, those who don't necessarily sit in government positions, but are the ones who are pulling the strings. So the Shia Coordination Framework, which are a collection of political parties, including armed leaders connected to the Popular Mobilization Forces, they've come together and eventually somehow have come to Ali al-Zaidi as their candidate. He's also supported by Iraq's judiciary, including the head of the Supreme Judicial Council, Fa'ad Zaidan. So there are many, we can say, who Ali Zaidi is in a way representing. But what we know, and one of the challenges is who he's certainly not representing yet is the Iraqi public, because he's not been voted in. He doesn't have a political project. Many had not even heard of him. But that's the constituency that he has to now somehow build.
And am I right, you're saying that he has media business as well?
Yeah, he has a TV channel.
And is that useful to him? Does the channel promote his brand, if I can put it that way?
Well, I would answer in a very diplomatic way. There isn't much independent media in Iraq. Most of the channels are owned by political parties or political elites. Now, there's a spectrum about how much, each channel can push the narrative of their parties and try and be independent. But certainly, obviously, that channel is effectively owned by Zaidi, and now with Prime Minister, he's actually, some of the people from that channel are those advising him on communications at the moment. So he's looking to bring in some of that as well.
Okay. Now, in a recent piece that you wrote for Chatham House, you said that perhaps his biggest challenge is dealing with the armed militias. You mentioned it, the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF. Can you break down what the challenge is and the likelihood of this new prime minister being able to rein in the militias?
So since 2003, since regime change, but let's say, since 2017, 2016, 17, the kind of fight against ISIS and the end of it, there arose these different militias and armed groups that are linked to the Popular Mobilization Forces. And, from Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi onward, there's been a kind of question, okay, well, the fight against ISIS is over. What do we do with these groups? Some of them have been put into the Iraqi state. In a way, there's a commission called the PMF Commission, which sits under the National Security Advisory, under the Prime Minister's office. Some of them are under there. But the reality is, most Iraqis and others know that loyalties don't rest in the Iraqi government, but actually rest in the commanders of the armed groups and the political elites who are connected to them and run them. So, since Abadi, there's been in different ways prime ministers who have sought in one way or another to tackle this problem. What do? We have all these armed groups and the central government has no authority over this. I would say that in this last war between the US, Israel and Iran over, March and April, whereas the Iraqi formal government wanted to keep staying out, to stay insulated from it, these groups changed their policies and started to attack the Gulf. And so this created a divide between those in Iraq who, since October 7th, have argued we should stay out, and these groups that are now acting closer to the IRGC and the existential threat that the Iranian regime views, and therefore uses these groups and Iraq as a launching pad in a way to go after US interests, Gulf interests, and such. So, what Zaidi is going to try to do is to try and take away the heavy weapons from these groups such as Kitab Hezbollah and Nujaba and others of these resistance factions, and is going to try and take their fighters and integrate them into the Iraqi formal security sector. This is going to be a challenge because these groups aren't going to give up easily. Now, some leaders, the more traditional armed group leaders, people like Muqtada al-Sadr or Qais al-Khaz'ali, who heads Asab Ahl al-Haq, have come out and said, we're with the Prime Minister on this and we're happy to begin a process of integration. The reason they say this, of course, is because they are so deeply embedded in the Iraqi state itself. They're the ones who choose the prime minister. They're the ones who choose they have their own officials in the government. Qais has members of parliament and such, that they feel confident that even if their fighters go into the system, the loyalty will still stay to the person rather than to the institution. Now, the other groups, such as Kitab Hezbollah or Nujaba and others that are more closely embedded with Iran and not as embedded in the Iraqi state, are going to resist this. Keep in mind that these groups attacked a lot of places in Kurdistan during the last war. They also attacked, Iraqi government buildings and actually killed an Iraqi government intelligence officer. So there is a very real risk that if the new prime minister can, actually wants to pursue this agenda to go after some of these resistance groups, they won't go down without a fight. And so the question will be, is he willing to potentially have some kind of civil conflict to pursue this agenda or not?
That is a frightening thought, because Iraq has been through so much for such a long time. The thought that this could break down into effectively it could be a civil war is what you're saying. The weaponry that they possess, you mentioned heavy weaponry. How heavily armed are they?
Yeah, and just to say, I don't think a civil war is on the horizon in any way. I just think that this is ultimately going to be what stops the prime minister from actually being able to pursue this ambitious program that is coming, he's calling for, which is to end militias. So it's likely that these groups will continue to exist because of that. The weapons they have, obviously they have drones. We've seen a lot of these drones kind of cause nuisance, let's say, or havoc across Iraq and across the Gulf. They're pushing as well, and to get more missiles from the IRGC. they're willing to fight. For them, this fight is not about Iraq. In fact, they often don't see the borders between Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. This is a fight of an existential fight against foreigners, against Americans, against Israelis. And of course, there's that kind of Shia centrism to this fight for them. So they do have some weapons that obviously will be asymmetrical when compared to others, but they've already proven that they can cause problems.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too, and you've touched on this, Renad, but the war, the Iran war, has put Iraq in a tight space. It's caught, well, really in a squeeze between Tehran and Washington, because the Trump administration is saying, you've got to do something about these guys, as only Trump can put it. But then also, the Gulf is being hit as well. I would imagine that the Gulf states will be putting pressure on Iraq. So how is that playing out, and how can this young and inexperienced prime minister, inexperienced in terms of politics and diplomacy, how can he deal with that squeeze?
This is the question. And this is a big problem for the Iraqi government. Baghdad has, for several years now, increased its outreach to the Gulf, stressed this point that Iraq is multi-aligned. It is not only under Iran's orbit. It wants relationships with the U.S., for example. In the last few years, we've seen very big U.S. companies come back to Iraq, like Chevron and Halliburton and others. We've seen increasing contracts from Gulf countries and companies to Iraq. So there is this push from the Iraqi government to pursue one trajectory, and then these groups are putting that at risk. Why would, the Emiratis or the Saudis or the Kuwaitis engage with Iraq or the Americans if you have groups in Iraq that enjoy impunity, that are able to get away with attacking these countries? So what can this new prime minister do, I think, is precisely the puzzle here. Every prime minister starts out very ambitious. There's all these promises of ending corruption and going after these groups, and it never really works out. And so I think in this case, there is potentially an opening. You're seeing in even not just in Iraq, but look at Lebanon and elsewhere, governments that potentially see an opening to move away from Iran's orbit, trying to pursue that. But, my concern is that this won't be that easy. And as much as, Tom Barak, who represents Trump in Iraq, as much as he will push and as much as they will want to support someone like this new prime minister, my concern is that their patience might not be very high. And this is something that will take a long time, even if successful. So the new prime minister has a very, very high mountain to climb.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too that Tehran, when you look at how they've come out of that war, they're feeling very bullish, and they're not want to see those militias simply rolled up and put away, are they?
No, the opposite. Whereas in the last few years, maybe we could have seen this axis of resistance becoming more decentralized in a way. What we're seeing in this last war is that the IRGC in particular, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is now potentially even more powerful inside the kind of decision-making in Tehran, is also more central to decision-making at the operational level with these groups in Iraq and elsewhere. So, no, I don't think that Iran is abandoning these groups or moving away from forward defense. On the contrary, these groups are integral to Iran's reimagining of the status quo in the Middle East.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and Renad Mansour, director of the Iraq Initiative at London's Chatham House. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details now to subscribe to our daily newsletter. Sign up and you receive the first 2 months free. That's arabdigest.org. Let's look at the economy, Renad. In early June, you ably chaired a Chatham House session on the financial sector, and there have been some reforms and some good news on that front. Can you give us an overview of those reforms and what they could mean going forward?
So in the banking sector in particular, with significant pressure from the Americans and others, the Central Bank of Iraq has instituted reforms since November 2022 that basically stopped most of Iraq's banks and those kind of currency transfer houses from getting access to US dollars. And the point was that Iraq was this bank where Iranian groups, Iran allied groups, or others were able to easily find banks and you have those banks give them access to US dollars that helped Iran overcome sanctions. And so it was a big mess of a banking system. So in this very specific sector, over the last few years, the regulations have been very strict. And only a few Iraqi banks have actually been allowed to trade in US dollars. And when they do trade, they have to have a corresponding bank that's not, outside of Iraq. So those measures have kind of cleaned up to some extent the problems that we saw with corruptions and armed groups gaining access to US dollars. And the hope, is from the Iraqi government side is that this can now translate into further reforms across Iraq's financial and economic sectors. That's a big question, but yeah, at least on the banking sector, there is significant push from Baghdad to incorporate into the international financial system in a better way.
Yeah, and I can see there would be wins for that. But on the sidelines, I was speaking to an Iraqi who's in the financial sector, and he said, there are 50 private banks in Iraq. And I said, oh, that seems like an awful lot of private banks. And of course, the Prime Minister owns a bank. Is that a problem? Too many private banks to really, get this thing kicking off and having significant impact?
Yeah, and not only too many private banks, but these banks don't, they're not doing what traditional banks do. And I'm no expert on this, but, these are not banks that can give out loans or mortgages or credit to help kickstart a middle class in Iraq. Most Iraqis still don't trust banks. When they get their salaries, most of them will keep it in cash. And the old joke is that they keep it stashed under their mattresses. There's still that lack of trust in the banking sector in Iraq. So these banks often don't really do much for the economy. And, without fiscal reforms there, it's hard to see that moving forward. So yes, there are too many banks and they're not doing what, traditional banks should be doing in Iraq.
Okay, well, let's then move on to corruption, which is, as you well know, a huge, huge issue. Is this a government that can take on the massive corruption that is standing in the way of Iraq, realizing its economic potential, to say nothing of helping the Iraqi people?
I think it would be very difficult for this government to really take on corruption, because when we talk about corruption in Iraq, we're not talking about petty corruption. We're not talking about bribery, a bribe here or, an official there who's been put in position because of bribe. We're talking about an entire system and how it governs. We're talking about, these political parties that install people, including the prime minister and president and ministers and director generals across the Iraqi state. So we're talking about, hundreds of senior civil servants who do the bidding of political parties. Iraq is a very wealthy state. Because of oil, its budget exceeds often $100 billion a year. And yet the country doesn't have sufficient electricity or gas, and going into the summer, this is going to be a problem. It doesn't have medicine. It doesn't have sufficient health care. Why is that with all that money? Because in all of these ministries of health and electricity and elsewhere, these political parties, through these elites, who through these civil servants, siphon off the cash not to redistribute to society, but to their private bank accounts to become wealthy and then compete with each other. So can this prime minister, who has been put in place by these parties, go after those parties? We've seen several times in the past that is not possible, and so it would be hard to see it happening, out of the blue this time.
Yeah, and I'm just going back to those 50 private banks. If they're not doing traditional banking, are they doing what's known here as family banking? That is, you deal with the banking concerns of very wealthy families and manage it to their benefit.
Yes, that's right. And, there is a lot of money in Iraq, and the gap is becoming more apparent every year. I mean, you can go to parts of Baghdad now, and see cars that I mean, I'm not a car person, so I don't know their names, but very expensive, what I'm told are very expensive cars, and properties and apartments being built up, and buildings, that are to some extent cleaning money, supporting certain very wealthy Iraqis, but it's not really being redistributed to the rest of society, and so that will continue to be a problem.
And you can go from these incredibly wealthy districts of Baghdad into what incredibly poverty-stricken districts, can you?
Yes, exactly. And so Iraq, in one, there are parts of Baghdad, if we just take this capital as an example, where they're so overcrowded, there's no electricity, and yet even then people are struggling to make ends meet and to pay rent, whereas you have these new buildings that are being put up, nobody really living in them, and all they are doing is just driving up the price, and inflation is becoming a huge issue right now.
Yeah, okay. Inflation's an issue, and is there money laundering going on? Is that how some of this corruption money is being dealt with?
So one of the problems in the last few years is, as it's become more difficult to trade in U.S. dollars, to get your money out of Iraq, of course. You have people who have a lot of money who it's more difficult to, for example, go to put it in the bank in Dubai or elsewhere. The Lebanese banking system has suffered significantly since 2019. Those would have been the traditional places where they could take their money. That's not possible anymore. Therefore, invest inside the country, and some will put a positive spin on it to say we're reinvesting in Iraq and all of this. But what I know when I talk to most Iraqis is they want medicine and electricity and a decent standard of living. These beautiful apartment complexes that are being built aren't really going to be representative of what most Iraqis are looking for.
Yeah, of course, the war has further strained the economy because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Now Donald Trump says that he's got this memorandum of understanding electronically signed. So, but as ever with Donald Trump, it's hard to separate reality from the bombast. But look, if there is finally this deal that ends the war between the U.S. and Iran, who knows what the Israelis will do, but what will it mean for Iraq to be able to put the war behind it? Is there an opportunity there to move things forward?
I mean, most Iraqis who I've talked to really wish for this war to end, of course. And even when, I make the point that it's actually very difficult to see an end in sight, and that this is likely to be a war of attrition that continues in the next year or two. I mean, Israel and Iran, as you say, are both now looking to change the balance of power in the region and will continue to use military means to do so, notwithstanding where the U.S. sits on this. Iraqis push back and say, no, this needs to stop, because one of the biggest successes that the Iraqi government had since October 7th was not being part of the war. Really the only country linked to Iran and this conflict that never fell in the way that you saw Lebanon, obviously, Yemen, Syria, elsewhere. Iraq managed to stay out, and so that was largely seen as a success. Now at the same time, not only is Iraq in, most Iraqis also, because of the sense of humor, are very, quick to point out that Iraq is the only country that's being hit by all sides in this war, which means it's in a very precarious place. And that this war and the Pandora box that has been opened means that any conflict in this region, Iraq is one of the main battlegrounds and will be one of the shadow wars that will continue. So certainly a deal is good for Iraq. It's just hard to imagine what that deal looks like, because the belligerents of this war aren't done reshaping the region to their end.
Yeah, certainly. And Israel says they're not done. They're not getting out of Lebanon, which is apparently part of this MOU that's been signed. And you're right that there is Iraq being hit from all sides. Tough job for Mr. al-Zaidi as Prime Minister. I'm sure that we're all hoping that he can find a way through and steer Iraq into a better place.
Yes, definitely. And, sometimes you have to think outside the box. And so if this very young businessman finds the sort of magic solution that Iraq's political elites have struggled to find in the last 2 decades or more, we can all retire and say that, we never had the right solution. But we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, well, I don't see you retiring anytime soon, Renad, but in the meantime, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me, Bill. It's been great to talk.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was Renad Mansour, Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa Program and Director of the Iraq Initiative at London's Chatham House. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. No sponsors, no advertising. Our support comes only from our subscribers. For more information on subscriptions, if you sign up, we're offering 2 months free. Head to our website, arabdigest.org. We're following the Iran war and other developments in the Arab world with analysis and commentary from a team of Middle East experts you will not find anywhere else. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.